Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us at this webinar today. I am Mihnea Cătuții from Energy Policy Group in Bucharest, and I will be hosting this meeting. We're going to discuss today the role of district heating networks in decarbonizing heating and cooling supply, but also how district networks themselves can be decarbonized in coming years. To give you a quick overview of the project within which we are having this webinar, the Climate Reckon 2050 project is a platform for intra-EU dialogue on national long-term strategies. It started all the way back in 2017, and it aims to connect national experts involved in drafting and implementing long-term strategies and provides a forum for exchange on experiences, best practices, which is why we would very much welcome you to come in with questions and comments and be active in our debate today. The main project partners, the implementing partners, are Ecologic Institute Berlin, the main host of this webinar today, WISE Europa from Poland, the Stockholm Environment Institute, namely their Tallinn office, EPG Bucharest, and the Josef Stefan Institute. The project is funded by the German Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety through the OIKI initiative, as well as the European Climate Foundation. In terms of the agenda, I am now giving you a brief presentation of how the event will unfold. We will then have a short intervention from Luciana Miu, the lead author of a very recently published report on district heating in national long-term strategies, where she's analyzed together with two other colleagues from EPG what member states think and how they envision the role for district heating within the wider decarbonization context. And then we will have a panel discussion, and we have here today with us Morgan Henley from Bankwatch, Andreas Graf from Agora Energiewende, and Mr. Claudiu Crețu from Termoenergetica, the district heating operator of Bucharest, Romania. Before we start, I wanted to make sure we set some housekeeping rules for the discussion. I will invite you to please use the Q&A function. If your questions are targeted to a specific speaker, please mention that as well. You can find the Q&A function on the bottom side of your Zoom app. You can also upvote questions there, which makes my life easier a bit to pick up what you think is most relevant to be brought to both Luciana immediately after she'll make her presentations on the report, but also to the panelists for the discussion that will follow. You can also use the chat for any other comments, but please be aware that we might not pick that up into the discussion. So again, if you want to pose a direct question to the speakers, use the Q&A button on your screen. Wanted to mention as well that the discussion is recorded and will be made available online at the project website on climatedialogue.eu. Without any further ado, I want to introduce my colleague, Luciana Miu, who's done an absolutely fantastic job at coordinating this report, which gives an overview of the role that different member states give to district heating in their long-term strategies. Luciana?
Thank you very much, Mihnea. I hope you can all see my screen. If not, please do shout at some point. Thank everyone for joining. I'm just going to take you through quickly a presentation of our main findings from the report on how district heating, and more precisely low carbon district heating, features in the national long-term strategies of member states. Just to kick us off a bit about EPG, who we are. So we are a Bucharest-based independent think tank specializing in energy and climate policy. It's our 8th year now. Now, we've traditionally focused on energy-related topics, but we're now expanding our work in sort of non-energy topics, starting with industry and transport decarbonization, and in the future looking towards waste, agriculture, and other climate-related topics. So just to kick us off in terms of our work on what is low carbon district heating and how is it perceived in member states in terms of getting to climate neutrality by 2050. So we conducted an assessment of the currently published long-term strategies, which are basically pathways to how member states are going to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. The long-term strategies are sort of overseen by the EU's governance regulation published in 2018, which also oversees the publication of the national energy and climate plans. But it has relatively loose requirements compared to the NECPs, and as a result, many of these long-term strategies are high-level vision-type documents rather than operational or programmatic documents, action plans with specific commitments to particular technologies or pathways for decarbonization. Even though the deadline for publishing these long-term strategies was in 2020, so far we are still missing 4 long-term strategies from Bulgaria, which is currently in draft form after having undergone public consultation, but also Ireland, Poland, and Romania. So the work that we've done in our assessment focuses on the 23 long-term strategies that have been published to date. So why is district heating important? Why did we decide to look at it as a vector for decarbonization? So it's considered a key to decarbonizing heating, given its ability to integrate low carbon energy sources, particularly in heat dense urban areas, but it's also more efficient than individual low carbon heating solutions. And currently, district heating supplies heat to approximately 60 million Europeans, and district heat networks are mostly fueled by natural gas through combined heat and power plants. In general, we see the most developed district heating networks in countries that tend to have colder climates, for example, the Scandinavian countries that have well-established modern district heating systems, which very often are fueled by renewable energy. But we also have a significant share of member states, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, that have quote unquote legacy district heating systems. These very often date from the communist period. They tend to be fueled by fossil fuels and require repair and upgrading to get to modern, efficient district heating standards. There are, of course, some countries which are simply not suited to district heating systems. For example, warm climate countries where we initially went in with an expectation that we won't see district heating mentioned so much in their long-term strategy simply because the need for heating is lower. District heating has also gained some attention in light of recent developments in the Fit for 55 package. So there are provisions for district heating in the recast to the Energy Efficiency Directive, Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, but also the RePowerEU plan, which has just really strengthened the ambition of Fit for 55 and also put a spotlight on low carbon district heating as a potential vector for decarbonization, but also for energy security. District heating as a way of supplying heat varies across member states. This is obviously something very important to keep in mind when we do this assessment, that the picture is quite different across member states. So we have member states with very low shares of district heating. Like I said, some of these are warm climate countries like Cyprus and Malta, where we don't see district heating actually mentioned at all in the long-term strategies. But others, for example, Belgium and even Italy, they do have provisions for investing and exploring low-carbon district heating, even though their shares are currently quite low. In these countries, generally, what frustrates district heating development is a lack of frameworks, regulatory and planning for developing district heat networks. Then moving on to medium share district heating countries, these, as mentioned before, a lot have legacy district heating systems based on fossil fuels. And one of the main challenges here is that they're in serious need of refurbishment and they have become less competitive compared to individual heating solutions, leading to some customers, for example, in Eastern European countries, to actually unbranch from the district heat network and choose individual heating solutions instead. And then we have some high share countries with lots of district heating in their heat supply. Denmark has the highest share of district heating according to this study from 2020 of the EU. And here the focus has already shifted a lot towards low carbon, towards transitioning towards renewable energy. And the market here for district heating seems to be quite saturated. There's not so much in the long-term strategies in terms of expanding existing networks or upgrading them, but rather focusing on making them as low carbon as possible. So in our assessment, we wanted to answer a couple of questions. The first one was, what role do member states see low carbon district heating playing in their pathway to climate neutrality? Because district heating is a key vector for decarbonization of especially residential heating supply. So how do member states perceive this, and are they tapping into that potential? So firstly, we assess the extent of how district heating is covered in the long-term strategies. We did a bit of a qualitative assessment in terms of whether district heating was significantly mentioned. By this, we mean whether it was discussed to an extent that allowed us to build a picture of what their role would be in 2050 in achieving climate neutrality. And we found this in approximately half, so 12 of the 23 long-term strategies. Like I mentioned before, there were some warm climate countries that, for obvious reasons, did not cover district heating, but there are also some Nordic countries which didn't devote a lot of attention to district heating. This was sometimes due to features of the long-term strategy itself being more of a vision document than an action plan, but in other cases, perhaps more could be done to outline what the current role is of district heating and how this could be capitalized on in the future. What we did find was in countries that do have a low share of district heating at the moment, there is significant mention of it's playing a role in climate neutrality. So this was in Italy, France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, which currently have low shares, but did talk a lot about expanding district heating and shifting from fossil fuels where there is any kind of district heating to low carbon energy sources. In terms of what role specifically district heating would play, the main role was overwhelmingly in the residential sector. Although some long-term strategies that also point to district heating as having a role in industrial decarbonization, this was primarily the use of industrial waste heat to fuel district heat networks. In some cases, the idea of district heating was part of a wider sort of district or neighborhood-based approach to decarbonization. For example, in the German long-term strategy, there is a discussion on developing quote unquote model neighborhoods for low carbon living, which would include investigating the potential for district heating in these neighborhoods. There were some interesting, very specific advantages to district heating that were highlighted in some strategies as well. For example, in Croatia, the use of district heating was promoted as a way to ensure that cultural heritage buildings, so buildings with historical value, would not have their facades, quote unquote, blighted by individual heating systems, but would rather be connected to a district heat network. This is just a bit of a visualization. I apologize if it's a little bit difficult to see this. The image is also in our report, but it's just overlaying the current share of district heats in heating supply in member states with whether the district heat network is mentioned significantly in the LTS or not. We have some not applicables in there. That is for member states that don't have their LTSs officially published. But as you can see, most of the Southern European countries, aside from Italy, don't mention district heating significantly. We have some countries with low to medium shares, so France, Germany, but also Czech Republic and Croatia, that do explore the potential of low carbon district heating. And then again, the northern ones with high share, it does vary in terms of how well district heating is tapped into in the long-term strategies, but most are already highly developed and don't devote a lot of time to further potential for district heating. Some other things that we looked at were, okay, if district heating is going to play an important role in the country's climate neutrality, does the country have targets or milestones? And here we found that it's a bit of a mixed bag. We only have specific commitments to expanding district heating or attaining a certain fuel mix in 7 countries, and most of these were also high-level ambitions, so very qualitative, like we want to increase the share of district heating, but not saying by how much, with 3 exceptions in Slovenia, Lithuania, and France, which all set targets for how much of the residential heating supply they want to come from district heating by 2050. But all of these 7 long-term strategies that included some specific commitment to district heating included at least one commitment on transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy and or waste heat, which is an obvious option for decarbonizing heating supply through district heat networks. And 5 of these also present specific commitments to building new networks, for example, in France or in Belgium, but also upgrading or repairing existing district heating networks. So, for example, in countries in Central and Eastern Europe, some of which have already applied for financing from the Modernisation Fund to specifically modernize their existing quite old district heat networks. In terms of the future fuel mix, so fuel switching is a big topic that is addressed in terms of getting to low carbon district heating by 2050. It's rarely quantified. So one big thing that's missing from the strategies is percentages of what kind of energy source is going to be used in fueling district heat networks. Virtually all the long-term strategies foresee district heating switching from fossil energy to renewable or waste heat. And when we say renewable, what the LTSs mostly mention is biomass, heat pump, solar energy, and some of them are showing an interest in shallow geothermal energy, Austria and Slovenia as well. In terms of natural gas as a fuel, there are some countries with significant coal legacy, like Czech Republic and Slovakia, that do highlight natural gas as being the fuel of the future for district heat networks. Their strategies were published before the current situation and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so it's unclear whether this will still stand as their envisioned fuel mix for district heat networks. Finally, we looked at two other quite important aspects of district heating. The first one to note is that there are technology components of district heating that can facilitate decarbonization. This is coupling district heating with thermal storage, using district cooling, using low temperature district heat networks, which are more efficient, so fourth generation district heat networks, and also cogeneration rather than heat only plants. So all of the long-term strategies that did mention district heating networks also highlighted at least one specific technology that they were going to use to get to low carbon district heat networks. The mentions are brief though. 5 of them explicitly said that district heat networks were going to be fueled by cogeneration units. This is already mainly the case in Europe. And sometimes this wasn't specifically linked to district heat systems themselves, but rather to the decarbonizing the whole heating sector. Only a few mentioned fourth generation district heat networks, so low temperature, more efficient. Italy was quite an interesting one because they mentioned both low temperature and high temperature district heat networks with specific advantages for both. When it comes to thermal storage, these were mentioned mostly in the context of optimizing the efficiency of the district heat network. And it was, again, 5 countries that made a mention of it, fairly high level. And finally, little attention was paid to district cooling, even in countries that might have significant cooling needs, especially considering upcoming climate adaptation. District cooling was not a subject of interest. And finally, we looked at a couple of other aspects around district heating financing, whether the strategies made provisions for how district heating systems would be financed. They're quite capital intensive, require a lot of investment and ongoing in terms of maintenance and modernization. We also looked at whether there was provisions for research and development around making district heat systems even more low carbon, more efficient, and building out the infrastructure, both for new networks, but also for upgrading existing ones. And here there was relatively vague commitments on the part of all strategies. Some countries in Central and Eastern Europe did pinpoint the idea of upgrading infrastructure. Some did point to the modernization fund, but weren't exactly clear on how they were going to use this funding source to upgrade their networks. Only 2 countries mentioned anything around research and development for district heating networks, and 5 did propose some financial instruments for decarbonizing existing district heating networks. Others were mostly quite vague, again, pointing towards existing European funding, but not specifying either the investment needs, quantifying it, or how this investment would be sort of staged over the future and how it would result in expanded or upgraded district heat networks. So just to draw this to a conclusion, our assessment showed that indeed district heating systems can be important decarbonization vectors, and this was recognized in many long-term strategies, but the extent of their potential for decarbonization wasn't always reflected in how they were covered in national long-term strategies. There were very few concrete commitments or targets around district heating. There was an emphasis on transitioning away from fossil fuels, but there was little in the way of quantifying which renewables or waste energy sources were going to be used and setting sort of targets or milestones between now and 2050 for transitioning. There was a limited focus on how technology can help further make more efficient district heat networks and contribute to decarbonization. Like I said, thermal storage or low temperature networks are addressed quite briefly. And these conclusions that we draw, just as a caveat here, they are likely applicable to other technologies, not just district heat networks, simply because the long-term strategies do tend to be quite high-level vision type documents. But we think that future long-term strategies could be significantly strengthened by better embedding district heating, if it's relevant to the country's circumstances, by really integrating both district heating and district cooling as key decarbonization measures, stating how the member state expects district heating to contribute towards decarbonization, and if it's not expected to, what alternatives are there. We also would suggest more concrete targets and expectations on how district heating networks would develop. As mentioned, they are capital intensive, they require a lot of time and a lot of funding for expanding and upgrading. So a more concrete commitment on how they will fit into a decarbonized heating supply would be necessary. And more attention should be paid to how they're going to be supported to ensuring, again, that these investments in big infrastructure are appropriately managed and directed in the member states. So I'll just leave it at that. And we've got time for a couple of questions, I think, mostly clarifying questions on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciana, and congratulations on the report. I know it's been a lot of work to go through all these long-term strategies in different languages. I know it's been quite an arduous process. There aren't any questions in the Q&A section right now, so if anyone still has anything to ask as a clarification to Luciana, she will be here with us for a few more minutes to answer them. For the panelists as well, if you have any things that you want to clarify from Luciana's presentation, please let us know. But in the meantime, before anyone else has time to add any more questions, Luciana, I wanted to ask you something, and it is a bit putting you on the spot in a way, but have to ask. So the vast majority of the long-term strategies have been submitted before this year, before the gas crisis, before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. How do you think the perspective has changed? Do you think that this is something member states are looking more into? What do you think that needs to be taken into account more now than it was the case in the years before when the long-term strategies have been elaborated?
Yeah, it's a great question. And indeed, a lot of these long-term strategies it's not only that they were published by 2020, it's that some of them are repurposed policy documents that were already existing. For example, I think it's the Czech environmental action plan or something like that was basically resubmitted as a long-term strategy. So I think the LTS updates, when they're due, they will reflect a lot more the current situation. And I think one thing would be around the future fuel mix. So as we were talking, there were some countries that in their long-term strategies did envision sort of natural gas as being the sort of fuel that district heat networks were going to transition towards. Whether that's the situation now is sort of unclear. But yeah, the potential of district heating in terms of sort of energy security, that's not something that I'm an expert in, but I think that's something that countries will be taking into account, whether moving towards these big infrastructure investments, which are more efficient if done well, is something that's worth doing in the context of most of them are fueled by gas at the moment. So yeah, I think we'll probably see some changes. It's interesting looking at the Bulgarian long-term strategy because that's in a bit of a weird position right now. So it's been submitted for public consultation. It was elaborated also in 2020 and then shelved for a long time because of government changes. So it's been published very, very recently, but it's not really accounting for RePowerEU or Fit for 55 or anything like that. And that is, a real missed opportunity. And I think we have to watch the updates quite carefully to make sure that, again, with the governance regulation being so lax around what the LTSs need to include, I think we need to be watchful of the updates and make sure that they're integrating the current policy context appropriately, because we have one example today of Bulgaria that just doesn't. So long answer short, I think definitely the view on district heating will be affected by the current energy price crisis. Just remains to be seen how.
Yeah, I think it's very well put, and indeed, a lot of these strategies have been based on older documents. Even the more recent ones, it seems the same. They are based on old modeling, which will need to be redone, both to reflect the legislative changes in the Fit for 55 package, RePowerEU, but especially the gas crisis we are going through. And I'm sure that in the panel we're about to start, we're going to have plenty of chances to discuss how do we see the role of district heating in this new framework, how can it contribute to decarbonization of heating and cooling supply, but also what the situation is of the existing networks and how the gas crisis has affected them. I see Andreas Graf has a question as well, hand up, so yeah, please, Andreas.
Yes, thank you. So I noticed from your analysis that you really focused on the long-term strategies, but then in a couple of cases, I think you also drew on some NECPs as well, where no long-term strategy was available. And then you didn't really touch on an additional set of documents that is available these days, which is the long-term renovation strategies, which were required under the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So you have this whole set of documents. Now, I mean, going through all of these and looking at least, you know, NECPs versus long-term strategies, and I mean, where after this exercise, what do you think needs to be done really so that, or better said, what do you think the purpose of long-term strategy should be in the end? And you mentioned a few things that you think could be clearer, or you know, that were deficient, so to say. But what would you see as the vision for what the long-term strategy should strive for, and how those other documents feed into it?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. And the scope of this exercise was the long-term strategies, and we decided to look at the NECPs as sort of, you know, closest thing to long-term. Obviously, they're different in many, many ways, but where we didn't have an LTS, we did look at the NECPs. Now, in terms of what the LTSs should be, I think umbrella documents is probably the best way, umbrella strategies even is the best way to describe them. So something that brings together all of these, you know, maybe more focused operational documents like the NECPs, like renovation strategies, recovery and resilience plan. Again, from the example of Bulgaria, which is quite the unique case in that, you know, it did come in after the RRP and after the like building off Bulgaria's NECP, that was a really great opportunity to build the long-term strategy as something that all of these feed into, and which just provides the long-term vision and where all of these sort of pathways for decarbonization align and they make sense together. Bulgaria, I think, has a bit more work to do until they can get there, but that's where I would see the long-term strategies as being, you know, this is our vision for 2050. This is how we're going to achieve it. This is the targets we need to get to by 2030 in order to get there by 2050. Here are the action plans and strategies we have until 2030. Here is how we're going to build on them from 2030 onwards, and not just saying we're going to keep doing the same thing or we're going to, you know, strengthen it. Again, this is something the Bulgarian LTS does a lot. Just says we're going to continue the same policies after 2030, or we're going to strengthen them, but not saying how. So the long-term strategy should be the sort of umbrella strategy that brings everything together, but that's also quite clear in terms of our short-term actions that are coming in the next sort of, you know, 8 years before 2030, how they are going to be built upon and transformed if needed by 2050, with special emphasis, you know, for example, on gas as a transition fuel. How is that going to be then phased out to get to climate neutrality? So yes, it's in the name, right? It's the long-term strategies, bring everything that we've got on the ground and currently operable together and make sure that it holds water until 2050. I would say that that's the role of long-term strategies.
Thank you very much for answering that, Luciana, and thanks a lot, Andreas, for the question. Indeed, it's important to also understand that within this project, we've tried as much as possible to contribute to the elaboration and evaluation of the long-term strategies as useful instruments for growing a path towards reaching climate neutrality in 2050. In the meantime, there is one comment in the Q&A section by Niels. I apologize, I don't know your full name, which is about the status in Denmark, which is massively building out its network, expanding it to 10% more households than currently. And they have a law that supports it in heating. They want to install CCS for waste incinerators and ultimately resulting in net negative emissions. Luciana, I will try to frame this as a question to you, just if you remember, because I know there's been a lot of strategies to go through. Have any of them mentioned this, the ability potentially for the heating networks to go into net negative emissions?
Yeah, no, I know this is a very good point. So thank you, Niels, for bringing it up. Again, just to sort of caveat here that Denmark's long-term strategy is a very strange document. It's very, very short. And I think more sort of information around district heating can be found in other programmatic documents like the energy agreements of Denmark. And we did mention that in the report as well. So that's really good to know. And in a future LTS of Denmark, I would really like to see all of this kind of brought together. With CCS on waste incineration, and that's very, very popular in Scandinavian countries now. And I know Denmark's giving a sort of big push for CCS in general. So there is, I think, definitely potential there. I recently went to the CCUS forum in Oslo, and they've got a waste incinerator just outside of Oslo, one of Fortum's, well, now they're called Celsio, waste incinerators that are doing exactly this. They're building a carbon capture plant to to capture their emissions, then store them offshore as part of Northern Lights. One of the interesting things that they mentioned here was that this waste incinerator, which produced both electricity and heating for the district heat network, would now become a sort of net consumer of electricity after installing the capture plant. And this is because of the energy penalty associated with carbon capture. So getting to net negative, I mean, it's great on paper. I think an assessment of how much extra energy consumption comes along with carbon capture would need to be done. There's obviously all sorts of issues with system boundaries of then how do you account for energy consumption, the transportation part and the injection part. But even if you're just looking at capture, it's really interesting to see that, Fortum, after having, produced electricity and sold it, they're not going to be using all of the electricity that they produce from waste incineration to power carbon capture, and I think even take more in from the grid as well. So I know it's a very interesting topic, but again, I think more assessment needs to be done on how much it's going to contribute to net negative.
Thanks a lot, Luciana. Yeah, I think it was a very good answer, and also for highlighting the energy efficiency penalty that is incurred through the use of CCS. But of course, this is something that countries are exploring. You mentioned Oslo. I know in Stockholm, the same. They are exploring the same for the district heating network. So before we move on to the panel, there is one last comment which refers to the Bulgarian LTS from Detelina Petrova, saying that Bulgaria has already submitted it, which we know as well. The delay is due to the desire to streamline it with the recovery and resilience plan. I'm not sure, Luciana, if you want to add anything more on the Bulgarian LTS here.
Yeah, well, the latest that we have, and I checked the official EU website a few days ago. The thing with LTSs is, as opposed to NECPs, when they're submitted by member states to the European Commission, as far as I know, there's no review process and there's no sort of request for updating or anything like that before making it official. The submitted LTS is then the official LTS. So we're working off of the version that was submitted for public consultation, which I know closed a couple of weeks ago, but it doesn't seem to have been officially published yet. In terms of streamlining, I think that's really, really important in the version that we're working off of. There do seem to be discrepancies between the Recovery and Resilience Plan and the LTS, mostly in terms of ambition levels. So the RRP obviously introduced sort of commitment to a coal phase out date, whereas the LTS, a lot of the analysis that's been done in sort of 2020 refers to continuing to use coal past 2040. So that's great that there's an intention to streamline it. I would also then want to see, again, the current policy context being streamlined in, because we have more than just the RRP. We have Fit for 55, we have RePowerEU, et cetera. So on the right track, look forward to seeing the final document.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luciana, for taking this comment on the Bulgarian long-term strategy as well. Thank you for the presentation very much. And again, congratulations on this very interesting report that you've done together with the other EPG colleagues on district heating in national long-term strategies. With that being said, we will now move to the second part of this webinar, which consists of a panel discussion. We have three expert panelists here today with us. Claudiu Crețu from Termoenergetica, the district heating operator in Bucharest. We have Andreas Graf from Agora Energiewende, who's quite the expert on decarbonisation of buildings, and Morgan Henley as well from Bankwatch, with whom we will discuss shortly a bit about what's happening with the EED and legislative policy funding context for district heating. The format for this panel will be, initially, I'll give the floor to each of the three panelists for intervention of about 5 to 6 minutes. I will follow up with some questions, in total about 10 minutes per participant. If anyone has questions, please add them in the Q&A function. We will have 20 minutes put aside to raise those questions to the panelists and to discuss some of the points they've raised. So, with that being said, three perspectives on district heating and their role in decarbonizing heat. For the first panelist, I would like to give the word to Mr. Claudiu Crețu, the Director General of Termoenergetica, formerly at Elcen, the owner of the CHPs in Bucharest, now the owner of the operator of the district heating network. And I would like to ask you if you could share with us what are the main challenges of operating an existing network, especially one in a large city like Bucharest, which is a legacy from communist times, relies on high flow temperatures, but at the same time can make a contribution through efficiency gains to decarbonizing heat supply in countries like Romania. Mr. Cățu.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present the situation in Bucharest. We have the second largest district heating system in the world. It consists 1,000 kilometers of primary system and 4,000 kilometers of secondary system. Right now, we have more than 500,000 households and apartments and a few thousand institutions, hospitals, schools who rely on this system. Unfortunately, this legacy is very complicated in the last few years because a few investments were made, and that's why we have a lot of breakdowns. We have a lot of inefficiency in this system, and right now we are in a crisis because every day we try to survive with this system. This crisis also is an opportunity to modernize and to invest. So let's present, we rely on 4 big CHP plants. Old technology, 2 of them put in function in the 60s. Russian technology from the 60s. One of them from the 80s, and only one CCGT, General Electric, put in function 10 years ago. So from 4 CHP plants, only one is quite new, modernized, and efficient. About the pipelines, I've told you we have a lot of breakdowns, but these days they were signed, the contracts for rehabilitating pipelines with European funds. So even we are in a crisis, we have good perspectives because we have contracts signed and investments are about to be done. And also we prepare projects for the modernization fund. And we all know that in the modernization fund, district heating are priority projects. So speaking about all the big picture of district heating in Bucharest, we need investments in new CHP plants, of course, hydrogen ready. We are looking at CCUS because carbon is quite expensive, and we want to be greener, if I could say so. And also, right now, we are in the moment when we analyze the possibility to integrate renewables. And when I say renewables, I want to present the possibility of geothermal energy, and we are studying right now the possibility of integrating in the north area of the city, because we have geothermal energy in the north area of the city. Right now there is a private center that uses this energy, so the possibility exists. And also we are trying to integrate all new technologies. That's why we are looking at, for example, Scandinavian countries, Denmark, especially for this kind of solutions. Unfortunately, and I speak frankly, it's very complicated in Bucharest with waste to energy. Why that? Because in Bucharest, we don't have one mayor. We have 7. this is the situation in Bucharest. We have 7 mayors, 1 general mayor and 6 district mayors, but they have a lot of political power, if I could say so, and it's very complicated. It's very complicated to synthesize or to concentrate political will in order to resolve this kind of strategic or structural issues. That's why we have a lot of problems with district heating situation. But in the last 2 or 3 years, the situation became so critical that everybody understood that we need investments in the system. So we are making right now these investments, unfortunately, in the 90 minutes of the game. But what it is important is that we have the market, we have the customers. Only 5% of the customers go out of this system and have chosen individual boilers, and so 95 of the apartments in Bucharest, of the old apartments in Bucharest, rely on the system. So we have perspectives. We are investing in the pipelines. We have projects in digitalization, in automation. So we want to integrate technology in order to have a more flexible system. We need a more flexible system. We want to integrate renewables, and we look for geothermal energy, as I said, and of course new CHP plants, but more flexible, more efficient, and of course carbon less, if I could say so. If you have particular questions, I'm here. In a few words, this is the situation in Bucharest, and I could say that Bucharest was saved in the last 3 years by global warming. It's a joke, but it's a reality. It's reality because I remember when I was a kid in Bucharest, we had strong winters. But right now, for example, last year, no snow, no frozen areas at all. And right now, we have in November, today in Bucharest, 26 degrees. 26 degrees. And I remember a few years ago, we used to start district heating in Bucharest in October, in the first days of October, 4th October, 5 October. And right now, we are looking at the meteorological prognosis to see when the winter is coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the overview of the system in Bucharest, of its problems, also of the administrative mess that is the city, which sort of makes things more difficult to implement, especially for things like waste incineration, when you have different companies dealing in all these sectors, districts. It makes it much more difficult to collect and to try to think about solutions that, as we've heard, are being implemented in Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden, in the North countries we've called climates. And indeed, it's sad but true that the fact that we are in a warmer time right now is helping with a system, a network that fails sometimes during the winter because of lack of investment for very many years. And thank you very much also for outlining some of the decarbonization options you are looking at. It's fantastic to hear. I know it's difficult to discuss when there are immediate problems with supplying heat for this winter to also look at longer term decarbonization options, but it's very important that your company and Elchen get involved in this and access the financing that is available for countries like Romania. I just wanted to have a very quick follow-up question on this, because you mentioned a lot about how to decarbonize the supply itself, but now, as you are the director at Termoenergetica, the operator of the network, I just wanted to ask that in the perspective of decarbonization, do you think that changes to the way the network is designed itself need to be made, because we do rely on supplying heat from, just as you said, 4 main points through a very widespread network? Would smaller scale solutions for fewer building blocks make sense? Would it make integrating renewables easier? Would it make providing lower flow temperatures that is easier to decarbonize easier?
Yes, in my opinion, we can integrate in the next years a few more CHP plants, but a little one, more close to the consumers, in order to have low temperatures and also not to have so big losses. But I don't speak about the replacement of the existing system. No, the solution Bucharest, because it is so big, is to integrate all these solutions to have more points of production, also renewables or thermal engines or so on. But the idea is a transition, because the system is so big, and all this transition must be done in a silent way in order not to disturb all these big pipelines.
Thank you very much for that. Please do stick around with us for the panel, as well as there might be some questions coming from the audience, which we will raise to the panelists at the very end. Thank you for the overview given of the system of Bucharest, a system that has immediate difficulties, but as you mentioned, is also looking at ways to decarbonize. With that being said, I wanted to move to our second panelist, Andreas Graf from Agora Energiewende, who I would like to ask to place a bit better district heating within the greater decarbonization efforts and what solutions we have for decarbonizing the existing systems.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you see my slides?
I think they are still loading. Now we can see them.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult task to wrap this all up in 5 to 6 minutes. So I'm just going to make a few points, obviously, to stick to my time. So the first is, district heating also plays a role in the short term. Today, we've talked about the long-term strategies, the long-term vision, but they are also potentially a part of our solution in the short to medium term in addressing the energy security challenge we have and the shortage, better said, the reduction of Russian gas supplies. And we did a study earlier that we came out with earlier this year, where we also looked at all of the gas savings potentials in the building sector until 2027 based on a long-term strategy. So we essentially took our 2050 scenario that we were developing and we said, okay, on the pathway to 2050, what can you do until 2027 with some adjustments for the current circumstances? And discovered that if you were going to really full throttle into your long-term strategy, district heating could really make a significant contribution even in the shorter term. How? Through densification of existing networks. So, we heard today that, Bucharest already has an existing network. 95% of households are still connected. Well, get it back up to 100, get it up to 105, get it up to 110, expand it, connect people who have gone off the grid or who could still be on the grid, and make better use, especially where district heating is in fact a more efficient solution than individual heating, which is very often the case. Secondly, it's obviously building new heat networks, obviously in the time frame until 2027, that can only really apply to networks that are really getting off the ground running now. So the planning has already started, the commitments are already being made, but especially those heat networks where, the final investment decisions, are shaky, going full into those, making sure that all barriers to permitting and construction are moved aside, so we can go full throttle into heat networks. And then it's, of course, all of the other measures that were in part mentioned already, which are, integrating renewables, waste heat where possible, implementing short-term operational efficiency measures like decreasing supply temperatures, plugging those gaps that we heard about. And then, of course, in the short term, it's also a story about fuel switching, especially in the next couple of winters, where we're already seeing today district heating operators that can switch, for example, a gas CHP plant or a boiler to heating oil, doing so, or of course where existing coal plants still exist, those are also being utilized more heavily than in the past. Now, this is a separate scenario that we did for Germany that looks at how Germany can become climate neutral until 2045, and this is, of course, only the heat supply section of this scenario. But I think it's important to note that, while there are some differences between scenarios, and we saw, some also differences in the long-term visions, by our estimation, it really plays a very important role, and that's both in, the countries where district heating already plays a significant role today, and I would count Germany in those countries, even if it doesn't have the same share as, for example, Denmark or Sweden, as well as in those countries who don't. And those reasons include, and we've heard it again already a bit today, those challenges of getting urban, very densely populated population centers decarbonized, getting all of those homes fit with, for example, heat pumps. That is going to be a challenge. But also, in many of those urban centers, we now have gas grids that in the long run will not be economical to operate with hydrogen or biomethane in any significant quantities. Those amounts, especially when you look in integrated scenarios, a lot of those volumes of hydrogen biomethane will have to go into other sectors for more valuable applications of those very scarce resources. So, the gas grid will not be there in the future, and it will not play the role that it does today. And if it plays any role, it will be incredibly expensive to operate with the low amount of fuels that are still going through them. So district heating also plays a role here to manage decarbonization in urban centers, manage the electrification that we're doing with all the heat pumps, where we are going to be rolling them out in mass in urban centers, as well as, again, this transition away from natural gas. Now, again, this, however, also means a massive transition. We've heard today, and so here are just a few numbers from exactly the scenario you just saw. What that scenario was showing is an increase in the market share of district heating in overall heat supply to 26%, massively increasing the connections to district heating over that same time period. That's new district heating networks as well as new connections to existing district heating networks. It's essentially completely phasing out fossil fuels in district heating by 2045, and in parallel scaling up renewables. And here I divided that between the let's say also scarce, but less problematic from an integrated system perspective sources of renewables and waste heat, and hydrogen and bioenergy that will also be part of the solution for peak hours. And in both cases, you see the need to massively scale. So the geothermal, the solar thermal, and the waste heat, as well as the hydrogen and bioenergy. And that is a challenge and something that we'll have to go at with full force in the coming years. So that's essentially the concluding remark. It's that, this is something that will take a lot of attention and focus in the coming years, and something that we will have to get at quickly. Why? Because a lot of this investment that we will have to make is also investment that will need to be front loaded. This is investment into infrastructure that will has to be put in place for us to be able to utilize it. And where a lot of the other incorporated investments of renewables, waste heat, et cetera, have to plan in accordance with existing infrastructure. You're not going to get other projects for waste heat, for geothermal, for bioenergy feeding into district heating made unless you have the infrastructure in place. And then once you have the infrastructure in place, you have to make all those other investments. So, we have a lot of investment coming towards us, and we have to make the right decisions in a very short amount of time. So that's going to be a major challenge, but at least by our estimation, it's an absolutely necessary one. And with that, I'm closing my presentation. Thanks.
Andreas, thank you very much. I think you managed to cover so much ground in such a short presentation. So yeah, congratulations for touching on everything from the need of expanding networks where you have them, because it is the efficient way to decarbonize heat, for speaking about some of the short-term options for reducing gas demand as well, which can contribute to the coming winters. You mentioned also temporary switches, for example, to fuel oil. I think Mr. Crețu can confirm the fact that in Bucharest, for some of the CHPs, we can do that as well, but for a very temporary time. You tapped into the differences between places where district heatings are already in place and what you can do there, as opposed to those where they are being developed, and you can already do it around decarbonized technologies. About the general role of heating, especially in the decarbonization scenarios for Germany. And very interesting, I think it was at the end where you highlighted the investment needs as well. So basically between mid-decade now to early 2030s, that's when the bulk on investments needs to happen. This means that project needs to start to be prepared now to be finished within 2 years, so they can start implementation and become operational by 2035. So relatively urgent, I would say. What I wanted to also ask as a follow-up was because we have spoken about the system that exists in Bucharest, in Romania, where there are some financing opportunities, for example, through the modernization fund, which are not available to most Western, Northern member states. I just wanted to ask about the German experience, if you can share a bit with this, and about the plans to expand that the government has, about how state aid is designed to support this, and what lessons can be learned from this exercise.
Yes, so in the case of Germany, I mean, I think there is certainly some experience to share with cities that were leading in the effort to decarbonize their district heating systems over the last decades, perhaps not at the pace that we would need to see, towards the climate neutrality scenarios, but nonetheless. But over the last years, the main discussion has been around, we need more funding. It's certainly not enough. And so we were kind of waiting in great anticipation over 2 to 3 years for a major support program that was just given state aid approval earlier this summer, and is now on the books and ready for municipalities to apply for, and district heating network operators. And I think the unique thing is first the scale. So it's 3 billion euros. And it's over the next only few years going to be spent with priority at the beginning on creating those transformation plans, getting the district heating network operators to really get prepared for scoping out how they're going to make this transition happen. Secondly, actually helping that transition happen with capital and grants and loans. And finally, then for some of those investments, also giving them operational support. So large-scale heat pumps and solar thermal, et cetera, where they might not be in the money. Now, the question is that really as much of a problem today? Open question now that gas prices have significantly changed, and maybe there's a different economics. So I think that's a little bit open still, and the exact details, from my understanding, have not actually been revealed yet. So that's something they're still working on, but that is something, if it's needed, that's also going to be discussed. So I think there is a lot to look at, in the sense that it focuses really on helping district heating networks who currently might not have the attention or the let's say the funding within their budget to go to that consultant and really hire that help they need, or make the studies they need, as well as to develop a strategy that convinces then the regulator to put out more money to know that it's going towards the right things. And secondly, I would just briefly mention that the German government has also today revised funding for local governments to have more support for their municipal heat planning. So essentially they've said, okay, also here we want you to speed up. This is something that needs to happen with urgency. So for the next, until the end of December 2023, if you do your municipal heat planning until then, or at least make the application for the funding for an external consultant and for the help here, we will pay 90 to 100% of that. So those local communities are enabled, are empowered to do that planning and encouraged, because after December 2023, that money will fall away again. So I think those are the kinds of things, really putting money towards planning, but also giving some incentives to do it quickly. I think that's something that's quite notable in Germany at the moment from the countries who aren't already as far ahead as Denmark and Sweden, but are moving quite rapidly in that direction with the urgency due to climate.
Thought for the overview, and yeah, for all these different things that are being done right now in Germany to enable district heating to decarbonize and to plan for the coming years. I think is becoming increasingly important to figure out how you can expand the networks, and as well how to decarbonize, especially in the context of the gas crisis, but also in the perspective of decarbonization, and also of the new standards and rules that will be imposed through the files that will come out of the Fit for 55 package, which brings me to our final panelists today, Morgan Henley from Banquet, whom I would very much like to ask to give us a bit of an overview of how legislation can steer decarbonization of district heating networks, especially through some of the files that are being discussed right now at EU level, of course, with the Energy Efficiency Directive being the most relevant, but also the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive touching on this. You have the floor.
Hi, thanks for having me. Just to repeat, my name is Morgan. I work at CE Bankwatch, specifically on district heating in Central and Eastern Europe and moving it towards renewables. So yeah, to get started, let me share my screen.
Well, while you load your screen, just very quick reminder to everyone to add your questions now. After Morgan's intervention, we will move to a Q&A section. So if you want to ask any questions to the panelists, please do so.
So, okay. So, as was mentioned before, and also I'm the last to present, so sorry if anything I say is a bit repetitive of what you've already heard. We've had some really nice speakers so far. But as I mentioned before, there's a Fit for 55 package, and a part of that is, you know, it will affect a lot of things, but district heating is included in that. And one of the biggest chunks of the legislation of the Fit for 55 is the Energy Efficiency Directive, the EED. And it's currently in the trialogue stages right now. So it's a bit at the final stages. So now just, you know, getting the agreements between the Council, Commission, and Parliament together. And I just picked out some of because it's a really, really big piece of legislation. And so I just picked out some of the maybe most relevant for district heating. One of them is there's a provision on energy planning for communities, for municipalities. And right now they're debating the threshold for that. So whether it would start at municipalities with 30,000 inhabitants or 50,000 is what was proposed by the Commission. But in general, there will be, we're quite sure that there will be this provision on energy planning, which will be quite, has a lot of potential to really help move the ball on decarbonization. Because a lot of municipalities and cities just simply don't have those plans, or they're very broad, as we heard already from about the national plans. So it really, but also that will require a lot of skilled people on the municipal level, which there is a gap that exists. So hopefully there would be matching capacities to take that task on. The news from Germany that Andreas was just mentioning is a great example. Of hopefully something that can be replicated across the country. Another thing that's being debated in the EED, which future is not as certain, is the requirement to collect information on all CHPs, so yeah, combined heat and power, cogeneration plants, and district heating. And so this would be able to give these planners, give the municipality a better idea of what's going on. So whether that's like the type of fuel they're using, their emissions, how efficient they are, things like that. So this is something that also is being done in Germany with mixed results, as far as I know. But maybe Andreas has a better idea if it comes up later. But this is something that potentially could also, help move the ball towards decarbonization, because it's one thing to make targets, but if there's no actually follow-up, making sure that they're actually being met, then it's not so useful. Then again, there's also the energy efficiency first principle that's mentioned in the EED, and to making sure that district heating would also be in line with climate neutrality. So this is, right now, district heating is not necessarily required to be in line. So eventually having these benchmarks. And then this is the most tricky part of the EED is the definition of efficient district heating. So there's a few different provisions in it. And probably the trickiest is how long as CHPs would be allowed for. So the parliament's proposed only until 2035, whereas the commission has till 2045 with the council. And the tricky thing about CHPs is that the CHP probably is going to be burning a much higher, or it can operate at a much higher temperature. So for these legacy systems in Eastern Europe, that's mainly what they're using, and they need these high temperatures. But if you want to incorporate more renewables, it's probably going to rely less on CHPs. So something like solar, thermal, or geothermal. I mean, geothermal can be a CHP, but really rarely. And so it's also, if we really want to decarbonize, CHPs are probably not the technology that we would want to rely on the most. Then we can get into technologies later. And then also, there's percentages of waste heat. And waste heat is also a bit of a tricky area, because waste heat is probably, there's no provisions on where that waste heat is coming from. So it could be waste heat coming from, I don't know, wastewater retention center or a data center or metro, kind of, excess heat from processes that would already be happening. Or it can also be from, a steel mill or something that's really carbon intensive. And if a district heating network is reliant on these industries that are quite carbon intensive, it can also create bad incentives that they would keep burning it, even if they didn't need to produce the steel or I don't know what have you, because the heat was reliant on it, because you have to keep people's homes warm. So that's a bit tricky. And in general, we would ask for more clarity and a phase out date for when there would be waste heat from fossil fuels. And the EED, there's also the EBRD, the RED, the Renewable Energy Directive, which also has impacts on district heating. I'm not really going to go into those there, but just to say, with the Renewable Energy Efficiency Directive, there's the most important related to district heating is the provisions on biomass and what can be considered in the use of heating and is efficient. And then with the Buildings Directive, again, a big part of getting to decarbonizing district heating will be more efficient buildings. So having more efficient and more renovation and really deep renovation of buildings is really important. And that one is not close to being done yet. So there's still negotiations going on. So things can change there quite a lot in the Buildings Directive. And then, so the reason why all of these things are quite important, not only just from legislation wise, but they also have a big impact on the funding available from the EU. One that's already been mentioned quite a lot is the modernization fund. So the rules that are agreed in the EED will be also the rules that are applied for the modernization fund. So what CHPs can be financed, what's considered efficient district heating, things like that. So if CHPs can be go till 2045, that means gas-based CHPs would be included probably, and also would be eligible for funding from the modernization fund. So if we want to decarbonize district heating, that's a bit dangerous. Then, of course, the other finances, the European Investment Bank, they also base their lending rules on the EED, and as well as the cohesion funds. So all of these kind of reference the EED in some way. And so that's why whatever gets agreed, it has big impacts as well for the financing. And I wrote a brief about this, about the EED and its impact on financing with Ken, which I would be happy to share if anyone is interested. I think it's still relevant. So the future of district heating, it's also been mentioned a bit already. So there's a lot of renewable tech out there, and what does that mean for, you know, cities? So yeah, as I mentioned before, I'm based in Central and Eastern Europe, so we have a lot of the legacy older systems that rely on mostly gas and coal. There's still lots of coal in the region. And so there's a lot of technologies available that I've listed here: biomass, waste heat pumps, geothermal, solar thermal, and all of them are at different degrees of compatibility with different systems. And this is always kind of the rule with district heating, is there's no really hard and fast rule. Everything is going to have to be adapted to the local circumstances. So biomass, it's one of, it's being used quite a lot for meeting renewable district heating targets, or renewable energy targets in general, especially in the Baltic states and in Scandinavia. And there is, you know, as more countries move away from fossil fuel-based district heating, there is a big threat that there could be over-reliance on biomass. So there's also something to keep in mind, is how do we build a district heating system that uses biomass but that doesn't overuse it. Then yeah, the waste heat, as I mentioned before, making sure that it comes from more, I guess, better options than just really fossil fuel intensive industries, and making sure that, you know, it's done in a way that actually makes sense. Because, so for instance, if you have like a wastewater treatment center, most of the time a wastewater treatment center would be in a city. So the amount of heat that they're producing is probably on par with the size of the district heating, because, you know, more people, versus a data center where it can be in the middle of nowhere, and the heat that it's producing might not have a district heating system that's sitting right next to it ready to absorb it. So just things to keep in mind when considering the potential of waste heat. And then there's heat pumps. So yeah, there's an industrial size heat pumps that are already working in Vienna or Helsinki, different places in the north, I think in Germany as well. So there's a lot of potential there. But of course, with heat pumps, it would also mean increase of electricity. So it's also always important to keep in mind when we discuss heat pumps, is how do we also decarbonize the electricity sector, which is moving. It's probably faster than the heat sector, but especially in countries where there's still quite carbon intensive electricity production, it needs to be kept in mind, especially because we've seen, you know, analysis where switching to heat pumps would have more emissions than switching to biomass, because right now biomass is considered zero emissions, whereas the electricity that the heat pumps needed was quite carbon intensive. So it all needs to kind of be calculated. And then geothermal. Geothermal, there's deep and shallow geothermal, and with deep geothermal, there's a lot of potential, but it's very geographically based. But we've seen, like in some parts of Central and Eastern Europe, like Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, there's a lot of, there's a basin that could really provide a vast majority of the district heating needs. But there's a lot of concerns with geothermal too that need to be kept in mind, methane leakages, or the water, replenishing the water supply. And it's also quite expensive, but there's also needs to be, you know, with the planning, hopefully that would help signal to investors that it's a safe investment, because right now we see it's quite a quite prohibitively expensive. And then solar thermal also can be an option. And then I think I already mentioned a bit about heat pumps, and also Andreas addressed it a bit already, but individual heating versus district heating. District heating can be far more efficient, but in rural areas, it always has to be worked out. And I think that's where the planning on the municipal levels can really come in handy, because they should be experts who analyze that. So I think that's all for me.
Thank you very much again also for the information you shared with us, and the overview, both of the technologies, also what's happening, especially with the EED, and how it reflects the direction in which district heating networks need to go in the European Union, in line with the decarbonisation goals. Just as a quick follow-up on that, about how the EED has developed in recent months. Has the war in Ukraine, the gas crisis, left its mark on the negotiations? Is it something that's on the mind of in the trilogue and how is it affecting it? What have you seen that is different now than it has been when it was proposed by the Commission, the revision last summer?
Yeah, so with RePower, I mean, this should be the point of RePower, is to raise ambition and to phase out gas, but unfortunately, we don't really see it reflected in the negotiations. I don't know if it's because countries are just too afraid to make these kind of long-term decisions. And, instead there's more emphasis on replacing the supply, building LNG terminals, or new supply from different countries. So unfortunately, I don't see a huge wave of ambition on the European level. On the national level, you do see some things, as we heard about the German case, or I read today that Austria wants to ban all new fossil-based heating from next year, I think, or 2024. So I would imagine these are a result of the war. But and I mean, also, like with the modernization fund, you still see projects being approved that have new gas infrastructure despite RePower. So it seems a bit contradictory. And how do we make all of the different pieces of legislation speak to each other? I think that's always a tricky bit of EU legislation. So.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I just wanted to link this a bit to what Mr. Kresu was saying earlier. If you are still with us, I just wanted to ask as a follow-up to that, as Morgan was elaborating on how the gas crisis is affecting what can be done and what the solutions are for district heatings. You mentioned the CHPs that Bucharest has before, but we also heard that in order to move to a renewable and waste heat dominated system, we would need to phase out gas from heat supply in district networks. How would this work, for example, with a system like Bucharest? Are there any challenges that we need to be taken into account? Is this reflected in any way in the negotiations that are being had in Brussels?
Yes, unfortunately, the price of gas increased a lot. And also, the price of gigacalorie in Bucharest doubled, but the whole price is subsidized by the municipality. Otherwise, without subsidies, the situation would be quite critical. Unfortunately, we don't have in Romania a proper legislation for district heating to increase district heating. This is a big problem because people don't understand the benefits of a centralized system. Only district heating in Romania pay, for example, the carbon certificates. If you have an individual boiler, you don't have to pay anything regarding carbon or other things. So that's why it's quite an not a concurrence, a competition. It's not a clear competition. So regarding the gas, we have assurances from the government that we have enough gas for this winter. the deposits are quite full, and also Romania has his own resources. But the problem is the price, of course, which is very high, and that's why we need investment in a very, very fast time.
Thank you very much for that. And yeah, hoping that if anything, the current crisis accelerates even more the transition away from fossil gas, including in district heating networks. There's two sets of questions in the chat which I'd like to raise. The first one from Niels again, which is to Germany. Do you have any recommendations on the bottlenecking district heating build out, welders, construction workers, pipes? I will defer probably to Andreas on this because I imagine it is addressed to you. And there's a second question from Jakub Kibek to Andreas, who says that in your presentation, the demand for energy for heating is growing until 2045. How does this fit with the intended energy efficiency measures? Are there any analysis if it is possible to provide further human resources manufacturing capacity in the construction sector to implement the intended measures? So Andreas, I'll come to you first.
Yes, so I think that's an incredibly important question, and it's one that Claudio, I think I would be very interested to hear what the challenges are that you potentially face at the moment. I mean, maybe you don't have the transition happening at the speed, but if you were going into the modernization you were discussing earlier, what challenges would you face? I'd be very interested to hear that as well. I think what we've seen over the last months is that the whole issue of skills and capacity has come onto the agenda pretty much for the first time. I think there was some discussion on the broader renovation, construction sector, and limited capacity over the last year or two, one could say, with the renovation wave and some of the initial support programs running out there. And so we were starting to discuss it. There were also some concerns, that were rather from the supply side constraints we had with COVID and lockdowns, but then later also the supply chain challenges. Looking forward, we have less of slightly less of those, but we have still this fundamental problem that we have an incredibly inefficient construction sector at the moment, with lots of little companies that are doing things very, very inefficiently, but they're also aging. And so, in Belgium, you have, for example, the situation where you do have more leaving the construction sector currently out for aging and other reasons currently than are coming in. So it's actually going in the wrong direction. I think that's true in many countries. So we have to get more efficient. We have to actually find new ways of doing things, and the same thing applies then to the heating sector. And for heat pumps, I know that this attention is starting to come, right? So the recognition is there that with a lot of the regulations, for example, in Germany on exchanging heating appliances over the coming years, this is the 500,000 heat pumps that are supposed to be installed every year from 2024 are huge numbers that are really focusing the attention of policymakers. And so we're having conversations about how to change qualification standards, not to diminish them, but to make them fit for purpose, so that you don't have to go through 3 years to start doing the job that we need in the coming years, while still making sure that obviously the heat pumps are installed correctly. Asking manufacturers to really scale up their trainings, etc. And I think you need a similar conversation and focused, dialogue here for district heating. And I don't see it at the moment. So, I mean, of course, locally in individual cities, those capacity constraints where, those companies are moving forward or trying to move forward, they're facing those constraints today. And so they're dealing with them, but we're not having that national or EU conversation on how to address this. And so I think we need to look at the heat pump example as kind of something to aim for to also in the district heating sector. I'm not sure exactly who is best placed to lead that conversation. In Germany, I would think it was there's a new organization called the Competence Center for Municipal Heat Transition. They're there to support local government on heat planning, et cetera, and all of these issues related to building out district heating. They might be one of the actors to then have those conversations across the municipalities, and identify best practices, identify what is needed at national level, so really those supply chains work. I know that Euroheat and Power, the District Heating Association, is talking about having a new conversation about an EU heating strategy, a new one. The last one is from 2016. We need a new one. Maybe that should be a key part of that conversation to at least, push these conversations in all 27 member states. You won't resolve all the questions there, but at least it could be an opportunity to really have that conversation. So those are some of my ideas, and I don't know, maybe Claudio had some thoughts as well over things he's facing himself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andreas, for answering all these questions. And indeed, we see a very decentralized approach to decarbonize district heating, and there is a need for a platform to push this forward. We have only 3 minutes left of this meeting, so I would like to raise a question to Morgan as well from the chat, from Jakub Pibek again. Morgan, as you mentioned, carbon neutral solutions and geographical constraints are very expensive. How should district heating companies already dealing with huge financial consequences of surging prices of resources and CO2 allowances deal with the major investment costs, as we've heard from Claudio Crețu, very much the situation in Bucharest as well. Morgan.
Yeah, one thing I would also add to what Andreas was talking about, one thing that we also see in Eastern Europe is that a lot of the labor force who was working in the reconstruction industry were from Ukraine. And now this labor force is not here, and this will have major implications. And it's one thing that's, how that will impact us. I think it's one of the kind of elephants in the room that we aren't addressing much. So just to say that, and I heard from city official in Budapest saying, we just don't know what to do. We don't have a labor force anymore. So there's that as well. But in terms of financing, yeah, it's a huge problem of how to get, and this is billions and billions and billions of euros we need for these things. And so the prime givers of that would be public financing, because it's going to be very slow return on investment. These are not exactly sexy investments for private banks. So, that's where you would hope to see like the EIB coming in, EBRD, or the EU funds. And this is one thing that in Bankwatch we are also advocating for, is creating new funding streams for this heat transition, because we see that what's available now isn't pushing it far and fast enough. So maybe that's not a very satisfactory answer, but some of the solutions are also, I think, the technology can be expensive, but like for some of the waste heat, I heard from an expert, you can have it installed in a year. So, if you can switch from gas to, capturing the heat from somewhere else in 1 year, that's I think a worthwhile investment. So.
Thanks a lot, Morgan, for taking on that question as well. I'm afraid we've almost run out of time. So with that being said, I wanted to thank everyone who has participated in the webinar, both in the attendance and to the panelists. We've discussed together today the report that Luciana has led as an author on how district heating is featured in long-term strategies of different member states. And then we had a very interesting conversation about the role of district heating in decarbonizing heat and in the overall transition to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we've had with us today Claudio Crețu from Termoenergetica in Bucharest, Andreas Graf from Agora Energiewende, and Morgan Henley from Bankwatch. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your inputs and for your comments. And I hope to have this type of a conversation again in the future. Thank you very much.